Thank you very much for your company. Welcome back to the channel Transmission Lines Engineering TV. In the previous video, we talked about the origins of the technology to generate and transmit electrical energy in a massive way and turn this technology into something affordable, not only for the industry and the magnates of that time, but to put it at the service of humanity and pushing our civilization as we know it today. This series of videos is composed of 10 partitions. It's quite extensive. You can skip up to video A1-6-1, which deals with more technical subjects, but sincerely I recommend you not to leave your screen since it is a story that is well worth talking about it. So our viewers with experience in this industry, or those new values who wish to integrate to work in the transmission lines industry or other related disciplines, know the great history behind those towers and cables that we see practically every day. And simply, no one takes the time to think, well, how all this was constructed. We will see how the electrical technology, along with transmission lines, expanded towards the different continents in the world and literally wired the world. Universal history states that the beginnings of electricity took place in the United States, but there were other places in Europe where experiments were conducted prior to the Edison and Tesla. For example, the transmission line Tivoli-Rome in Italy, which came into operation in 1882 with 5.1 kVs and approximately 15 kilometers. However, the magnitude of development was not carried out on the scale that took place in the United States, where this technology was positioned as a new industry. We will talk about how electrical systems were developed by regions in the following order: North America, Canada and the United States, Europe, Russia, China, Asia, Japan, Africa, Madagascar, Greenland, Iceland, Alaska, Hawaii, Australia, Cuba, Central and South America, and of course Mexico. Each region has its great story. I hope to have the privilege of your company on these videos. North America, the electrical development of Canada. The Canadian electrical system had its beginning of massive generation in 1880, and since Canada is a country with abundant hydrological resources, from its very early history there was a huge boost to the generation of electricity from the potential of water, developing at the end of the 19th century the first hydroelectric power stations, since the Canadian government realized that in order to become competitive in the world economy of that time, it had to invest in the implementation of a railway line system and, in parallel, the development of its electrical system. Let's say that both industries, rail and energy, were hand by hand, let's say. Canada at that time did not have the current Northern Territories, so the province of British Columbia, better known as BC, started its electrical activities in 1883 on the island of Victoria and the cities of Vancouver, Ladysmith, Nanaimo, and the mining regions. Subsequently, around 1909, the electric system will expand to the communities of Oak Bay, Richmond, Port Moody, North Vancouver, and Coquitlam. In 1888, the first generation facility was built by the company Nanaimo Electric Light, which operated based on 25 kilowatts direct current generators. The first transmission lines in alternating current began in 1904, having a length of some 15 miles with 20 kVs, from the community of Lake Butson to Vancouver, and later expanding to the community of New Westminster. An expansion to North Vancouver will come later by 1905, and another expansion to connect to the community of Chilliwack will come in 1910. And as of this year, the province of British Columbia already had 23 generation stations servicing to 38 communities. The main generation companies were the BC Electric Railway Company and the West Kootenay Power and Light Company. By 1930, BC had a system of 58 generation stations, expanding its service to more than 118 communities. Another very important project of that time was the Hydroelectric plant of Steep Falls, located north of the community of Mission in BC. This station began its construction in 1909, and its first generator was put into service in 1911, having later expansions until in 1928 it was completed, until in 1995 it was replaced by a brand new station which is located right next to this one. And this station of Steep Falls became a beautiful museum and a monument to the world electrical industry. So whenever you have a chance to visit the city of Vancouver, believe me, this is a place that you want to visit. Now let's go a little bit to the east, the province of Alberta. Alberta began its electrification a bit later from other Canadian cities because Alberta did not have large urban centers until the then new communities of Calgary, Edmonton, and Lethbridge were developed from 1880. Calgary was the first urban center to be electrified in 1887, illuminating its streets around what is now known as Calgary Fort. On the other hand, the area called Prince Island, which is an area in downtown Calgary, owes its name to Mr. Peter Prince, who owned a sawmill and generated his own energy, sold his surplus energy for residential consumption. However, Mr. Prince had plans to expand. In 1882, the government of Calgary suffered a financial collapse and it was unable to support the electrical service, so it turned to provide this service to private suppliers. Mr. Peter Prince founded in 1889 the first electrical company in Calgary, Calgary Water Power Company, and was awarded the contract in 1894, making him a magnate of the electrical industry in Calgary. On the other hand, the city of Edmonton started its electrical system in 1891, and the population of Lethbridge had its first coal-based power plant in 1893. Now, as for the central provinces such as Saskatchewan and Manitoba, these were provinces merely devoted to agriculture. So that's to say that practically there was no other type of economic industry, so that the potential of having an electrical service was not even understood until the farmers by themselves, in order to increase their agricultural production capacity, they realized that needed to get modernized and adopt the new technology that will save them a lot of physical work by increasing their productivity. In the community of Prince Albert, it was the first to have an electrical system based on small private cooperatives and other small businesses, until in 1920 the first large companies were formed, such as the Northern Light and Power and Dominion Electric Power, and another one more, Midwest Utilities Limited, until in 1929 the company Sask Power was founded, which by 1948 had 35 generating plants and more than 8,800 kilometers of transmission lines. Now let's move further east. The province of Manitoba installed its first generation plant in 1900, located in the Manitoba River, what is now known as the Little Saskatchewan River, about 2.5 kilometers from the union with the Iceborne River, which was operated by the company Barrington Electric Light, servicing the city of Barrington by means of a transmission line of 14 kilometers, 11 kVs, but it will be dismantled completely by 1924. The first major Canadian project was in 1881 in Ottawa, Ontario, when Mr. Thomas Ahern and Warren Supper started the Ottawa Electric Company, where the provincial government built the first hydroelectric plant of Cloutier Falls, located on the Ottawa River in the area of Laverton Flats. And later, electric systems were developed in cities like Hamilton in 1896, where 5 characters known as the 5 Johns, Mr. John Dickinson, John Morrison, John Moody, John Patterson, and John Sutherland, visualized the future of electricity in the community, and in 1898 the first transmission line to the city of Hamilton was put into service from the Dussel Falls generation stations, and this line had 56 kilometers in 22.5 kVs. On the other hand, towards 1890, the Great Hydroelectric Project of the Niagara Falls was planned, which was jointly built by Canada and the United States. The construction of this project began until 1902, with which vast areas of both countries will be supplied with electricity, and in parallel, on the Canadian side, several small generating companies were invited to form part of a large interconnected system, which was not easy due to various interests. So it was in 1903 when the Ontario government formed the agency Ontario Power Commission to coordinate the work to build an interconnected system. So it was not until 1910 when the electric service was made public, reaching to supply other cities and towns. During the 20th century, new territories joined Canada, like Northwest Territories, Yukon, and recently Nunavut in 1999. Northwest Territories had its first electric project in 1948. It was in 1956 when the electric operations were expanded to cover the territory of the Yukon until in 1989 the agency Northwest Power Corporation was formed. As for Yukon, its electric system was born in 1907 to 1920 with the construction of a hydroelectric power plant system near Dawson City, with multiple major projects from 1911 to 1966. Canada is in fact a very young country whose electric system requires a lot of expansions even in nowadays. Now we will talk about the electrical development of the United States. From the invention of Thomas Edison, electrical systems began to emerge in the city of New York based on a system with low DC current voltages, with its first generation plant called Pearl Street, which served about 85 exclusive customers among the high society of Old Manhattan, and the magnates of the industry, in addition to public lighting. Subsequently, in 1882, Edison built the first hydroelectric plant, named Vulcan Street, in Appleton, Wisconsin. Prior to this, in 1881, the Electric Commission of the Niagara, composed of Canada and the United States, planned the construction of the largest hydroelectric plant in the world until then, the Adams plant, that will take the advantage of the flow of the Niagara Falls to produce electricity in a massive way and reach more transmission distances, and in this way completely revolutionize the concept of the electrical generation. This plant will transport the energy produced to the city of Buffalo, New York, through the first line in AC in 11 kVs and 25 miles in length. By 1886, another project took place that will reinforce the future of AC. William Stanley, financed by George Westinghouse, carried out the Great Barrington Electrification project west of Boston, Massachusetts, which will employ the device perfected by Mr. Stanley, the power transformer, and equipment with which it will take the advantage of high voltage transmission potential offered by Tesla AC to convert it or reduce it, the voltage, to a safe levels for its final use. The transmission line had a length of 1.2 kilometers. This system attracted the attention of more investors to expand the systems of generation and transmission of AC to other regions of the country. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, 1886. Another project in AC appears to service the railway signal systems for the company Union Switch and Signal Company. George Westinghouse, along with Oliver Schellenberger, developed a 3-mile transmission line system operating in 1 kV. Subsequently, the electrical systems will expand to the west and south of the country. In 1889, the longest line in DC will be installed, located in Portland, Oregon, along the Willamette River, having lines of 14 miles in DC. On the same plant, by 1890, more generation units were installed, this time in AC, and more transmission lines were installed with 14 miles length. This region of the United States will be strongly developed from 1910 to 1950 thanks to the power of the Columbia River that feeds power plants like Grand Coulee. Towards the state of Colorado in 1891, the Ames and Smuggler generation plant with 2.5 miles and 3 kV transmission lines to the mines will be built. Since the metallurgical industry was in a great time in that moment and it required the services of electricity. Again, George Westinghouse and his team made this project possible. Once in the 20th century, the biggest American cities had electrical service, and in addition, the country entered into the First World War, where it was driven for the first time the military industry, which required the beginning of the development of the electrical industry and in even larger scale, but the rural population was still, let's say, out of the equation, and the large percentage of these communities did not have an electrical service, and these communities had to develop their economical activities by manual methods, losing, of course, competitiveness. Another episode, as we know, the United States got into the Great Depression in 1929, and one of the most emblematic projects in history was the construction of the monumental Hoover Dam, which entered into operation in 1936 as a means to boost the American economy and get out from the Great Depression. By 1935, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt implemented the Rural Electrification Administration, REA, to develop electrical systems to these communities based on cooperatives so that the electricity was generated and transmitted locally and financed through the REA. Now, during the Second World War, the armed forces required a massive supply of agricultural products to maintain the troops, and this contributed somehow into the development of the rural electrification systems. And by 1953, more than 90% of the rural communities had electrical service. During the Second World War, the United States boosted its war industry, which required the large-scale development of its electrical systems to supply electrical power to the military equipment factories. Later, during the post-war period, the country's technological development will continue in other industries such as communications and consumer goods, especially the development of the space race, which will require a large-scale power supply for the development of the propellers for the sophisticated equipment in the space capsules. At present, the American electrical systems are formed by a great diversity of companies that build their very own infrastructures, and among all, they are interconnected to form a national electrical service. The United States currently faces the problem that large parts of its infrastructures, including the electrical infrastructure, had exceeded its useful life, and a reconstruction is necessary since the load demand in this country increases day by day by day. So this is a very fast explanation how the electrical systems were developed in North America. In the next chapter, we will see the electrical development of Europe. So I hope to have your company. Don't forget to subscribe and leave your comments on this one. Transmission Lines Engineering TV, training to power the world.
We copy you down, Eagle. Listen, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed. It's one small step for man.